Hello and welcome. This is going to be an alternate media special. This is going to be a book study, guys. I advertised it on TikTok, and I'm gonna do it. Um, I this book that we're gonna be doing is written by Andy Stanley. Now, I don't disagree inherently with everything that Andy Stanley says. He's written some fantastic books, particularly on relationships and how to work out relationships, and he's really good with that subject. But with this book, he tried to wax a little theological, and I don't know, man. It's a little stressful to think about sometimes. This is I'll go ahead and introduce the book. I do not keep book covers, like the little loose leaf thing that cover. I don't do that. I don't like them. I would rather just maintain books the way that they are. But this book is called Irresistible. I might even move that a little closer to the camera so that you can see it. It gets a little blurry. But Irresistible. It's like a $19 to $25 book. And in this book, he tries to explain. I'll give it a little bit of overview before we jump into it. He tries to explain in it the necessity for the modern Christian church to, in his words, unhitch itself from the Old Testament. I had to take a sip just saying that. And I get the point that he's trying to draw out. And his point is that Jesus is the Messiah, and his sacrifice is sufficient whether or not the Old Testament is true. That may be an oversimplification, but I feel like I've even heard him use that kind of characterization before. And that's terrible. You don't have a basis to prove the rest of the Bible without the Old Testament. And so we're going to be going over this book, and I am one of those people that has to read the introduction first, because the introduction is supposed to set the premise for us on how we're to understand the book, and where we're supposed to go with respect to how we understand the book. So we're going to read through the introduction. It's very short. For those of you who have the book, then read along with me. I will try and read it a little faster. I'm not a particularly fast reader or even a particularly good reader, so please bear with me and do not make fun of me. But he's also got it sectioned out. Simply Irresistible is the first section, where you've got the introduction and then chapters 1 through 5. So, starting section 1 in the introduction. In 2001, my son Andrew, who was 13 at the time, accompanied me on a trip to China. During our visit, we were invited to tour an American-owned leather goods factory. The owner was a friend of a friend. When we arrived, he graciously insisted on serving as our guide. Before we began the tour, he introduced us to a Chinese girl in her 20s who had worked her way from the factory floor into management. He asked if we would be okay if she shadowed us during the tour. 2 hours later, we were back in his office for a quick recap. As we wrapped up, he asked, "Does anyone have any questions?" To all of our surprise, raising her hand to shoulder level, our shadow spoke up. "I have a question," she said. Turning to me, she asked, "Are you a pastor?" I had no idea where this was going. I had not introduced myself as a pastor. I wasn't even sure if it was okay that I was a pastor. We were in China. For all I knew, she was a government plant assigned to follow us around all afternoon. "Yes," I said, "I'm a pastor." What she said next in her beautiful broken English caused the hair to stand up on the back of my neck. Ooh, so we're getting an emotional picture here. And I'm not trying to make fun of him, but say what you're going to say without making emotional appeals. How good is good enough? I recognize your voice. I was stunned. How good is good enough is the title of a book I had recently published. The manuscript was based on a message I had preached years earlier. She continued, 2 years ago, someone gave me a CD of your sermon, How Good is Good Enough. I listened to it over and over. Then I asked Jesus to save me and live inside me. Before I was simply empty. Now I am full. If you think I made this up, I don't blame you. I have witnesses. I'm not saying you made it up, man. I have no reason to doubt what you're saying. She went on. I wanted to go to church, but there are no churches in my city. I began attending a Bible study in an apartment close to where I live. Sometimes I ride the bus to church, but it is 2 hours, and I'm always late. The bus ticket is expensive, and I don't know anyone at the church. I was both honored and humbled. But she wasn't finished. Looking at her boss, she said, Can I ask the pastor another question? He nodded. Pastor, she said, why doesn't everyone in America go to church? I still haven't recovered from her question. Really, guy? It's a question. Why doesn't everyone in America go to church? Well, you're speaking to someone who lives in China where there is a ridiculous restriction on information. And in America, we do not have that restriction on information. And so there's less freedom of thought in terms of education. And that's not that I'm saying that, the right information will lead someone to atheism, but because there is freedom of information and people can look up information that attempts to, in some way, combat with the biblical text, that does lead to some people who don't feel the need to go to church, or do turn away from the faith. The freedom of information is part of that. And so anyway, I still haven't recovered from her question. I had no idea how to respond. I still don't. How do you explain thousands of empty churches to a young lady who would ride 2 hours to attend a church in another town? A young lady who would be there every time the door was opened, if there was a door to open. The Bible study she attended was part of a network of underground churches, what the Chinese government refers to as unregistered churches. Her participation put her at risk. Owning a Bible put her at risk. Talking about attending church in front of her boss put her at risk. Now, this is all true. In China, this is absolutely true. And there are people out there who would point out that Christianity is not the only religion that is regulated in China. And that is also absolutely true. Communism is a governmental system where the government attempts to be God. So no level of competition is acceptable. So yes, Christianity is not the only religion that is regulated in China. Islam is as well, and I think even some schools of thought within Buddhism and Hinduism are still in a way regulated. But be that as it may, Christianity is very heavily regulated in China. Imagine her shock if she were to discover that not only do most American Christians not read the Bible, in most churches there is a closet full of Bibles that have been left behind. I don't remember how I responded. I said something entirely forgettable, but I haven't forgotten her question. It's bothered me ever since. Her question is one of the reasons I've written this book. So why doesn't everybody in America go to church? Why is the church so resistible? Jesus wasn't. Once upon a time, his church wasn't either. Now, he's probably, if I remember correctly, because I've read through this once already, he's going to make an appeal to the swiftness with which Christianity spread throughout the world, historically speaking. And he's right. The church was not resistible at that point, because if you resisted, you got the sword. We call that time period, you can start it with the Crusades, which again, the Crusades were not inherently instigated by the church itself. Rather, the Crusades were instigated by Islamic parties, and the Crusades ended up being the church's response to that instigation. For anyone who has done their history correctly, that's what you will find. But be that as it may, the Catholic Church converted by the sword, just like Islam did, for a long time. So the mass spread of Christianity, historically speaking, which he'll be referencing, is partially due to violence, and in the other part due to what's called synchronism, which is the enveloping and bringing in of pagan practices, so that you can basically tell a pagan person, yeah, you can keep doing that pagan thing, just instead of calling the god the name that you've been calling it, say Jesus instead, and say that you're doing this for Jesus. Now it's okay. The Catholic Church was renowned for doing that, and I believe the Catechism even admits it, that synchronism was a heavy part of expanding the church. This would be where we get traditions like Christmas and Easter, which, again, I'll do video series on those at some point. So anyway, getting into chapter 1, we'll probably just do the first section. We're already 10 minutes into this, and I don't intend for these to be extremely long, so rather than do a whole chapter at a time, I'll probably just do a couple of sections at a time, and we'll work our way through the chapters. It may make the book study longer this way, but I think it'll be easier. I don't exactly intend for these to be long videos. A lot of the content that I'm coming out with for Patreon, I intend to be a little shorter, but and maybe even a little more rough, but it's content, and hopefully it'll be content that will help educate and help learn and help provoke thought and break echo chambers that people may be stuck in. So, chapter 1 is called The New Standard American Version. Much of what makes American Christianity so resistible to those outside the faith are things we should have been wrestling with all along. While many of us... so I actually agree with that statement. I just don't agree with his conclusion on it, but I agree with that statement. While many of us have been working hard to make the church more interesting, it turns out that fewer people are actually interested. This is true. In a big way. There was this massive wave where people were trying to appeal to the culture to get people interested, when the generation that they were trying to appeal to was actually interested in information rather than culture. And I know with the millennial generation that's particularly true. A lot of millennials have stopped paying attention to the church because their appeal to culture makes it seem cheap and like it's a sales pitch, when what they want is information. Millennials especially, we live in the age of information, and so that's what we want more of. That's why I have a channel on TikTok. It's why we here at Alternate Media have a YouTube channel. We're trying to present information to people who are interested. So yes, there are fewer people interested, as much as the church is trying to become more interesting. And while most people outside of the church continue to have a favorable view of Jesus, they don't necessarily have a favorable view of his body, the church. Right. I think he may even be referring a little bit to the emergence of progressive Christianity, where there is a view of Jesus that's not exactly even biblical, but it is favorable nonetheless, and because they have somehow distinguished and separated Jesus from the church, and really the Bible itself, their views of the Bible and therefore the church are more negative towards the Bible than the church. They're at least willing to try and reform the church, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. And they are, to some extent, trying to reform the Bible, I guess you could say, or redefine the Bible. Things like the 1946 Project, which I probably will do a video review on at some point. Trying to redefine Greek and Hebrew words in the text of the Bible, apart from what they already mean. Anyway, continuing on, he says, that's a problem. It would be like me saying, I like you, I just don't want to be around your body. The decline of Christianity in America, the popularity of the new atheists, and the meteoric rise of the nuns underscore. I'm not sure what he means by the meteoric rise of the nuns. Underscore something that's been true for generations, but didn't matter much until now. Okay, so yeah, the decline of Christianity, the rise of atheism, and the meteoric rise of the nuns underscore something that's been true for generations, but didn't matter until now. Well, if it's been true for generations, then it's actually always mattered. It's just that it is emergent now, because we didn't treat it like it mattered early on. That I don't know any better way to say that. Let's see. Modern mainstream Christianity is fatally flawed. We agree. These flaws make it fragile and indefensible in the public square. The populist version of culture, the populist version of cultural Christianity we see today is anchored to two assumptions that create a straw man version of our faith. Sadly, this straw man passes for actual faith in many evangelical churches. This version of Christianity is simplistic and easily discredited. For decades, college professors with biases against religion have found Christian freshmen easy targets. I will agree with that. Part of the problem with that, which I don't think he actually concludes here, is the isolationist nature that a lot of churches have taken. The unwillingness of Christians to look outside of their own faith, with seasoning, with some discernment, but look at other information and question and truly test your faith. So I know this is a particular problem with the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church, is that they struggle a lot to defend their own apologetic because they have no idea what the rest of the world actually thinks. They have an idea in their mind that they have painted of what the outside world is like, and it's completely unrealistic. And so because that's the frame of mind that they approach the world with, they're completely unequipped to actually address the problems of the world. And because the world actually knows the Bible better than they would assume the world does, the world ends up eating them alive when it comes to actual apologetics. So yeah, I do agree with him in that statement. Let's see. I've talked to, listened to, and read interviews, blogs, and books by dozens of folks who've left the Christian faith. I've yet to hear a story from anyone who abandoned Christianity based on anything directly related to Christianity. At least the original version, anyway. See, I don't know what he means there, because now granted, a lot of the atheists that I have met in my life have become atheists for emotional reasons. And it's it's an interesting thing, because if you were to ask them, they would give you this intellectual backstory about how they grew up Christian, and one day they just really started to actually ask the questions, and they'll almost paint themselves like they were intellectuals early on, when in reality, because I knew them at that time and I knew them at that age, what happened is they went through like a terrible breakup or something like that. There was some horrible emotional event that traumatized them to the point where they became angry at God, and so to spite him, they became atheists and now deny him, which is why they still have a very emotional response when you bring up the subject of religion. But that doesn't go for every atheist either, so I'm not trying to make an overgeneralization there either. There are definitely some atheists that came to atheism via intellectual means. But I think it's less than who would attest to such a means of coming to atheism. I think that the number that you would read about is probably exaggerated in a large way. But yeah, no, a lot of the intellectual discussion surrounding the faith and the reasons that they left the faith are based in things that have to do with Christianity, and by that I mean they have to do with the Bible, because Christianity has to be based around the Bible. That is the singular source text for the basis of Christianity. So if you're approaching Christianity apart from the Bible, even the Old Testament, then you've stepped off wrong, and this is going to result in you not being able to defend your faith. Which is the problem he hinted at earlier. So this is almost a contradictory statement when he says that he doesn't know anybody who left the faith for any reason that was directly related to Christianity, because if it's pertaining to the Bible, then that is directly related to Christianity. At least it should be. And he and I may disagree on that, and that's a problem. Let's see. I recently read a blog by a former worship leader who left the faith after she read the book Proving Contradictions in the Bible. After she read a book proving contradictions in the Bible. Apparently she grew up believing the foundation of our faith is a non-contradicting book. It depends on what you mean by contradiction. There are what would appear to be contradictions in the Bible, and it's only a contradiction if you approach it from what I will say is an incorrect premise. I actually referenced this in the study of Genesis that I'm going through currently. Going through Genesis chapter 1, 11 through 21. There are certain contradictions that would appear to be contradictions, but only if you approach it with an incorrect premise. One contradiction is that in Genesis 1, the birds come from the water. But if you read Genesis 2, the birds come from the earth. And this would appear to be a contradiction. But it's only a contradiction if you assume that the Garden of Eden was on the earth. Judaism doesn't make that assumption. Judaism has long understood the Garden of Eden to be in Olam Beria, the third heaven, or the third realm, or dimension, if you would have it. That is heaven, the third heaven, which Paul references. This is Olam Beria. This would be where Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, is. And so Genesis 2 being the creation of the garden, Genesis 1 being the creation of the earth, you can have a distinction. Birds on the earth came from the water. Birds in the garden came from the dirt. You actually, because they are not the same place in Judaism, you can actually make way for that contradiction. It's not a contradiction because we're talking about two different places. We're not talking about the same place. But if you approach the text from the premise that the garden and the earth are on the same plane of existence even, then yes, this is an apparent contradiction. So yeah, our faith is in part based on a non-contradictory text, because a contradictory text is inherently problematic. However, I don't personally believe that there are contradictions in the Bible. I think that people approach the Bible from an incorrect premise from which they conclude what look like contradictions. Let's see. A renowned New Testament scholar recently acknowledged he lost his faith and embraced atheism because of suffering in the world. Well, that is one of the primary atheist tropes. If Sky Daddy real, why bad thing happen? It's bad reasoning, because it doesn't account for Genesis 3. But be that as it may, but the foundation of our faith is not a world without suffering. Pain and suffering don't disprove the existence of God. We agree. It only disproves the existence of a God who doesn't allow pain and suffering. We agree. Whose God is that? Not ours. Ours promised it. People leave the faith because they had a bad church experience. Me too. So what? If somebody had a bad church experience, would you encourage them to still go to that church? Now, I would encourage them to leave the church as a whole. There are a plethora of other reasons that I would encourage people to leave the church as a whole, which has more to do not necessarily with leaving the church. That's bad phrasing. I wouldn't say leave the church, but I would say maybe abandon certain doctrines. I think it's a little foolhardy to try and expect someone to stay at a particular church in spite of a truly bad experience. Now, if it's just petty, then yeah, sure, don't be petty. We don't need to be Karens about our faith. But if it's a legitimately bad experience, then leave that church, sure. Maybe go find another church. But you shouldn't abandon it altogether. He continues on. Quantum physics doesn't undermine the claims of Jesus. Neither does natural selection. So, I'll just continue. Unverifiable Old Testament miracles don't cause our house to come tumbling down. I feel like he's trying to find a way to make evolution fit within a biblical framework, or at least within a Christian framework, because he's obviously accepting it doesn't necessarily fit within a biblical framework, which is why he specifies it doesn't undermine the claims of Jesus. Because what he's making a case here for is that even if it does undermine the claims of the Old Testament, it doesn't undermine the claims of Jesus. So he's trying to create a distinction here from which you can unhitch from the Old Testament. And this is problematic because the New Testament is predicated on the Old Testament. So this is what I would say is this is him actually conceding arguments that needn't be conceded, because there are already enough theologians that actually smash atheists on these very subjects. Just because there are a few who might be able to make good arguments on these subjects against the Bible does not mean that they're correct, especially when there are other theologians, apologeticists, and scientists who are as adept as they are at combating those people. But anyway, continuing on. By the way, if something in the previous paragraph made you wince, I can't tell you how happy I am you're reading this book. Keep reading, and you'll be introduced to a better, more robust version of your faith. In all my years of ministry, I've only had one conversation with an unbeliever, a Jewish friend who had an objection to Christianity based on anything to do with the claims of Jesus. Andy, he said, I just don't believe someone can pay for someone else's sins. I believe each of us is responsible for our own sins. I smiled and said, well, congratulations, you're standing on the threshold. That is the issue. So I just find it funny that he characterizes his Jewish friend as an unbeliever. This is one of the problems that I actually have with Christianity, is the application of the term unbeliever, because it's equally applied to the Jew and to the atheist, and this is fallacious. Okay, religious Jews are not unbelievers. They believe and worship the same God of the Bible that we do. They may actually disagree and say that Christians worship a different God, and that has to do with their thoughts on the Trinity, which I tend to agree with them on. So they would actually say that there is a level of idolatry in Christianity in the worship of Jesus. That's another subject for another time, but they are not non-believers or unbelievers. They are believers. They believe in the Bible. They believe in the God of the Bible. They may not accept the New Testament, but they could just as easily turn around and tell Christianity, well, you guys don't truly accept the Torah. And I'll have another video series addressing why that statement is technically true. So I disagree with the characterization there. I think the truth really would be somewhere in the middle, because Christianity certainly doesn't have all the answers. Matter of fact, there are a great many answers that Judaism has that Christianity could profit and benefit from, if they were willing to just sit down, shut up, and listen to a Jew speak, instead of approaching religious Jews with the arrogance of, well, I know that Jesus is the Messiah, and you don't, so I'm the guy who knows everything. And if you would just approach Judaism with the humility of understanding, they have had the Old Testament to study for a few thousand years longer than Christianity. So I would dare say there are some truths lying within the Old Testament that they probably have that Christians have never even attempted to think about. And I do know that to be true from my own studies. So this is where this section ends. The next section is called The Way Forward, so I guess we'll discuss that next time. He's still in the middle of building his case, and it's, so far, some of his statements I agree with. I agree with them for different reasons than why he is making these statements, but they're statements that I can agree with at face value. And there are some points that we actually are in perfect agreement as to what the problem is. How we think is the proper way to solve that problem is where we have some disagreement. So I expect we'll find more of that. Well, I know we'll find more of that. And as he is building his case, we'll end up seeing a little more. I will say this book is going to get a bit ridiculous, and even if you don't inherently disagree with anything that he has written so far, trust me, for any of my friends who are of a theological bent, and you already have a pretty good grounding in theology, even if you and I don't agree, because I know that a lot of my watchers, you don't agree with me on everything, I don't agree with you on everything, and what I appreciate is that you are still willing to watch, and even engage with me, and we'll have talks sometimes. You will find yourself, even if you haven't disagreed just yet, there are statements he's going to make later in the book. I can promise you that you're going to just be dumbfounded that he even made the statement. I look forward to discussing those, and sharing my thoughts on those with you. I think that we'll find some common ground and agreement there for sure. But anyway, I do hope that this has entertained you, if not blessed and educated you in some way. So all that being said, have a wonderful, it's evening here, so have a wonderful evening or morning or whatever time it is where you are. I hope you have a blessed day. Shalom.